Welcome back to Drowsy History. Or, if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm glad you found your way to this particular quiet corner of the internet, because tonight's story is one I've been looking forward to telling for a long time. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull whatever covers you have a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. There is absolutely nowhere else you need to be right now, and nothing at all that requires your attention for the next little while. And before I forget, I always want to know where these stories are landing. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It genuinely never gets old, picturing people all across the world lying in the dark at completely different hours, all drifting off to the same quiet story. Tonight, we're going to Victorian England, roughly 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria herself, a period that has become almost synonymous in the popular imagination with repression, with buttoned up collars and buttoned up feelings, with propriety and decorum, and the absolute performance of respectability at all times. But here's the thing: the Victorians were also human beings, and human beings, regardless of what era they are born into, have a truly remarkable talent for doing one thing in public and quite another thing in private, for maintaining a very composed exterior while a great deal that is considerably less composed goes on beneath the surface. Victorian women, in particular, have been subject to a historical narrative that makes them sound like decorative furniture, passive, obedient, fragile, corseted into submission, both literally and figuratively. And while there is real truth in the constraints they faced, that narrative misses something essential, something far more interesting. Victorian women had inner lives that their public personas were specifically designed to conceal. They had desires and ambitions and frustrations and pleasures that the official culture of their era had no respectable category for. And so, with the particular ingenuity of people who have been told there is no room for what they want, they found ways to have it anyway, quietly, cleverly, and with a degree of audacity that tends to surprise modern readers who have bought the corset and fainting couch version of the story. So close your eyes whenever you're ready. Let the night settle around you, and let's lift, very gently, the respectable surface of Victorian womanhood and take a long, slow look at what was going on underneath. To understand what Victorian women were getting away with in private, you first have to understand what they were expected to perform in public. And performance is precisely the right word, because the ideal of Victorian femininity was, at its core, a theatrical production, elaborately staged, exhaustingly maintained, and understood by most of the women involved to be at least partly fiction. The Victorian ideal of womanhood went by several names: the angel in the house, the true woman, the domestic goddess. It was articulated most clearly in a long poem by Coventry Patmore, published in 1854, which described the perfect wife as a creature of selfless devotion, infinite patience, and almost supernatural gentleness. She existed to serve. She had no strong opinions of her own, or at least none that she expressed. She was a calming, civilizing influence on the household, the moral center of the family, the keeper of its spiritual and domestic order. Virginia Woolf, writing decades later about the pressures on women writers, described having to kill this angel in herself before she could write a single honest sentence. The angel was always at her shoulder, Wolfe wrote, whispering that she must be sympathetic, she must be charming, she must conciliate, she must, above all, tell no lies about herself, which meant, of course, that she must never tell the truth. In practical terms, the performance of propriety shaped every aspect of a respectable Victorian woman's public life. Her dress, her posture, her speech, her opinions, her relationships, her reading material, her leisure activities, her very facial expressions were all subject to a web of expectations so dense and detailed that navigating them successfully required something very close to genius. She was supposed to be modest, which meant not drawing attention to herself, not speaking too loudly, not laughing too freely, not expressing enthusiasm with a degree of energy that might suggest she had been inadequately controlled. She was supposed to be delicate, which meant that any display of robust physical health was slightly suspect. Any evidence that she had a strong appetite or strong appetites was to be carefully managed. She was supposed to be pious, which meant regular attendance at church, visible engagement with religious devotion, and the kind of moral seriousness that was understood to be the particular province of women. She was supposed to be ignorant of anything that a respectable woman shouldn't know, which covered a remarkable range of subjects: the functioning of the human body, the realities of sex, the details of how money was made and lost, the facts of politics and law, the specific contents of the novels and newspapers and medical texts that circulated freely among men, but were considered too coarsening or too alarming for female consumption. And she was supposed to perform all of this naturally, effortlessly, as if it were simply her nature and not an enormous, sustained, carefully maintained act. The women who managed this performance successfully, and many of them did, with remarkable skill, did so while simultaneously conducting quite different lives behind the scenes. The private diaries, the secret correspondence, the hidden reading materials, the medically sanctioned pleasures, the female friendships that operated entirely outside the scrutiny of polite society. All of these constituted the real inner life of the Victorian woman, running just below the carefully composed surface. Let's start with the body, because that's where the gap between official ideology and lived reality was perhaps most dramatic and most interesting. The corset is probably the single most discussed item of Victorian women's clothing, and it has become a kind of shorthand for everything that was constraining and repressive about the era. And there's some justice in that. A tightly laced Victorian corset could reduce the waist by 3, 4, or even 5 inches, compressing the lower ribs, shifting the internal organs, and making deep breathing physically difficult. Women who wore their corsets extremely tightly, a practice called tight lacing, did genuinely damage their bodies over years of wear. But the corset also had a considerably more complicated relationship with Victorian female bodies than the simple oppression narrative allows for. For one thing, not all women wore their corsets tightly. The majority of middle-class women wore them at a moderate tension that provided support without serious physical harm, something more like a modern structured undergarment than a medieval torture device. More importantly, the corset was not universally experienced by the women who wore it as an imposition. Many Victorian women genuinely liked their corsets. They described feeling unsupported and uncomfortable without them. The corset shaped not just the body, but the way the body felt to itself. And for women who had worn corsets since their early teens, their absence was the unusual sensation. The domestic reality of the corset was also rather more relaxed than public presentations would suggest. Inside the home, away from company, respectable women loosened their lacing considerably or removed the corset altogether. The loose morning wrapper or dressing gown was a standard garment of the private female domestic sphere, and in it, Victorian women moved through their mornings with considerably more freedom of breath and movement than their public appearance implied. Servants knew this. Husbands knew this. The angel in the house spent a significant portion of her day in a pleasantly unlaced state. Underwear, more broadly, was a fascinating area of Victorian female life that operated almost entirely outside public discourse, while being privately a matter of considerable interest and complexity. The split leg drawers worn by many Victorian women, open at the crotch rather than closed, as a matter of practicality given the difficulty of managing multiple layers of skirts at the necessary moments, were a piece of information that existed in a strange social limbo. Respectable women wore them. Respectable women never mentioned them. And the combination of that silence with the specific design involved created a certain irony built into the very foundations of Victorian female modesty that the era preferred not to examine too closely. Hair was another private realm that public presentation deliberately misrepresented. The elaborate coiffures of Victorian women, the perfectly arranged curls and chignons and elaborate updos that their portraits present as natural attributes, were in many cases supplemented by false hair pieces, pads of extra hair, and purchased editions of various kinds. The daily ritual of managing all of this, the hairpins and the pomades, and the hot tongs, and the elaborate architectural scaffolding of a respectable Victorian hairstyle, was a significant private labor that the public effect was designed to make look effortless. The body itself, sweaty, menstruating, hungry, sometimes ill smelling and ill looking, was the great unspeakable reality beneath the angel's exterior. Victorian women managed it with practical ingenuity, strong smelling colognes and powders, elaborate garments designed to conceal and redirect, and the kind of dogged daily maintenance that the middle class domestic ideal required, and nobody discussed in polite company. Here is where the story of Victorian women gets considerably more interesting, and perhaps more than slightly surprising. Victorian medicine had a particular problem with women. The medical establishment of the era, almost entirely male, was simultaneously convinced that the female body was essentially fragile and pathological, and entirely unprepared to engage honestly with the specifics of what that body actually experienced. The result was a medical literature about women's health that is by turns absurd, alarming, and genuinely jaw dropping. The Victorians had inherited from earlier medical traditions the concept of the womb as a kind of internal weather system that governed the female body's overall state. Uterine dysfunction was blamed for an enormous range of complaints: anxiety, irritability, fatigue, headaches, fainting, depression, excessive emotion, and a general condition of nervous weakness that the Victorians called neurasthenia. The diagnosis most associated with this era, at least in popular memory, is hysteria, from the Greek for uterus, reflecting the ancient belief that the womb could become dislodged and wander through the body, causing various kinds of havoc. By the Victorian period, the wandering womb theory had been medically revised, but hysteria as a diagnostic category remained extremely broad and extremely useful for classifying women whose symptoms were real but whose causes the medicine of the era couldn't properly identify. The treatment for hysteria and for a range of related conditions was where things became particularly notable. One of the standard therapeutic techniques practiced by Victorian physicians for female patients presenting with anxiety, nervous irritability, and what the medical literature delicately termed pelvic congestion was a procedure performed by the physician intended to produce what the clinical literature called hysterical paroxysm. Let's be quite clear about what this means. Physicians were providing, as a legitimate medical treatment in their offices, manual stimulation of female patients to orgasm, and then recording the results in clinical notes as successful treatment of nervous symptoms. This was not considered sexual by the medical establishment of the time. It was therapeutic. The physician was a professional performing a clinical procedure. The patient was receiving treatment. The outcome was medical. The era's capacity for collectively not quite acknowledging what it was doing was in this instance truly extraordinary. The demand for this particular treatment was apparently considerable. Physicians complained in their professional literature that the procedure was time consuming and physically tiring, and that their patient load made it difficult to provide with sufficient frequency to all the women who required it. This complaint contributed to the development of a new class of medical device, the electromechanical vibrator, which was invented in the 1880s and marketed primarily as a medical instrument for physician use. The vibrator as a medical instrument appears in Victorian medical supply catalogs alongside tongue depressors and stethoscopes. It was advertised in respectable medical publications. It was discussed in clinical papers. It was, for a period of years, a completely mainstream piece of medical equipment whose primary intended use was the treatment of nervous disorders in female patients. The marketing was extremely clinical. The purpose across the centuries is rather less so. The shift from physician administered to home use device happened gradually as the technology became more accessible. By the early 20th century, vibrators were being advertised in mainstream women's magazines, not, of course, with any explicit description of their actual use, but as general health appliances and treatments for various vague complaints. The marketing was creative. The purpose was understood, at least privately. What this tells us about the Victorian era is something rather more nuanced than the simple repression narrative. The official culture had no category for female sexual pleasure as something legitimate and self-directed, but the medical establishment had created, entirely within the framework of respectable professional practice, an institutional structure for providing what desire actually required, while maintaining the fiction that desire had nothing to do with it. It is one of the more remarkable collective acts of willful misunderstanding in medical history. Victorian women kept diaries in enormous numbers, and those diaries are one of the great archives of the private female interior life of the era. They are also, to a degree, that historians have found consistently surprising, remarkably candid. The diary occupied a peculiar social position in Victorian culture. It was simultaneously a respectable, approved female occupation, improving, reflective, the proper exercise of a cultivated mind, and a private space that existed in theory entirely outside the social performance that governed every other aspect of life. The diary was, in the phrase of the era, a faithful friend, a repository for what couldn't be said aloud. The reality of Victorian women's diaries reflects that double nature. On the surface, many of them contain precisely what you'd expect: records of weather and church attendance and social calls and domestic accounts. The kind of material that would have been unremarkable if anyone else had read it. But beneath that surface layer, and sometimes not very far beneath it, something else entirely was going on. Anne Lister, a Yorkshire landowner writing in the early Victorian period, kept diaries that are now famous for the portions she wrote in a personal code she had devised herself, a mixture of Greek letters and punctuation marks that she called her crypt hand. Decoded, those passages describe her romantic and physical relationships with women in detail that is frank, emotionally rich, and entirely without apology. In public, she was an eccentric but entirely respectable gentlewoman. In her diary, in Crypthand, she was something the era had no respectable word for. Lister is an extraordinary case, but she is not unique in her frankness, only in the elaborateness of her precautions. Other Victorian women's diaries contain less systematically concealed, but still quite revealing material. Accounts of intense physical attraction to men who were not their husbands, described in a vocabulary of admiration and agitation that the writer may or may not have consciously recognized as desire. Descriptions of friendships with other women that have a warmth and physical tenderness that reads to modern eyes as something considerably more than platonic. Accounts of marital intimacy, its presence, its absence, its adequacy or inadequacy, appear in diaries written with a directness that the same women would never have managed in conversation. Lady Charlotte Guest, a remarkable Welsh industrialist's wife who translated the Mabinogion in her spare time, noted in her diary on various occasions her frank assessments of her husband's behavior in the marital bed, not with prurience, but with the plain, measured judgment of a woman keeping an accurate private record of her life. The language Victorian diarists used for forbidden subjects is itself a study in ingenuity. The vocabulary of nervous complaint covered a great deal. So did the vocabulary of spiritual feeling, intense experiences that a modern reader might identify as desire could be described in terms of religious ecstasy without anyone, including possibly the writer, having to fully acknowledge what they were describing. The language of friendship, devoted attachment, bosom companions, the dear friend in whose presence the heart felt its fullest expression, provided similar cover for feelings that had no other available name. Many Victorian women's diaries were written with the explicit expectation that they would eventually be destroyed. The number that were burned rather than read, that are therefore entirely lost to history, is impossible to estimate, but certainly very large. What we have is a fraction of what was written. What was written was itself only a fraction of what was actually lived. The full inner life of the Victorian woman is ultimately irretrievable. which is one of the quiet tragedies of the era and one of its most intriguing mysteries. One of the more delightful aspects of Victorian female social life was the elaborate semaphore of nonverbal communication that women developed within and around the conventions of polite society. When direct speech was constrained, and it almost always was, the body found other ways to say what the mouth was not permitted to. The language of the fan was the most famous of these systems, though historians debate how formal and codified it actually was, versus how much of the supposed code was invented after the fact by romantic writers who found the idea irresistible. What is certainly true is that the fan was a standard accessory in formal social settings, and that its manipulation, fast or slow, open or partially closed, held before the face or used to gesture, conveyed information about the user's mood and intentions to anyone paying sufficient attention. A fan held to the left cheek was sometimes said to mean no, held to the right, yes. Drawn slowly across the cheek, I love you. Opened and shut rapidly, you are cruel. The specific codes varied between accounts and between social circles, and the unreliability of any single authoritative system was itself useful. It meant that communication through fan language could always be plausibly denied. I was simply warm. The room was stuffy. The fan required adjustment. The man across the room, who had received what he understood to be an invitation, was technically working from an assumption he could not prove. Gloves served a similar function. The etiquette of when gloves were worn and when they might be briefly removed was a significant social signal in an era when physical contact between unmarried men and women was so constrained that a bare hand was a relatively charged thing. The woman who allowed a gentleman to take her ungloved hand was doing something that the propriety of the drawing room would have frowned on, and both parties knew it. The removal of the glove was sometimes accidental. It was not always accidental. Eye contact was perhaps the most powerful of the nonverbal languages available to Victorian women, precisely because it was the hardest to legislate against. You couldn't stop a woman from looking at someone. You could require that her gaze be modest and downcast in general, and propriety did require this. The woman who looked directly and boldly at men was considered to have a certain quality that reflected poorly on her character. But the glance from beneath lowered lashes, the moment of eye contact, held a fraction of a second longer than decorum required. The slow, deliberate look across a crowded room. These were available to any woman who chose to use them, and they communicated with a precision that the fan could only approximate. Victorian culture had a vigorous and rather anxious relationship with what women were reading and what they should be prevented from reading. The novel, in particular, was viewed with deep suspicion by a significant portion of the moral establishment. Fiction was considered potentially destabilizing for female readers. It stirred the emotions. It introduced ideas about romance and desire and alternative lives, and it was often read in the privacy of one's bedroom, unchaperoned, in a state of considerable psychological absorption. The libraries of Victorian England had strict policies about what could be lent to female readers. The circulating libraries, Moody's in particular, which was the dominant lending library of the Victorian period, exercised what amounted to editorial control over the fiction available to respectable readers. Novels were assessed for propriety before being purchased for circulation. Anything considered too frank in its treatment of sex, marital unhappiness, or morally ambiguous situations was refused, which meant that many of the most interesting novels of the era were effectively kept from the mainstream female reading public through this institutional gatekeeping. But the gatekeeping was never entirely effective. Books circulated among women privately, passed from hand to hand with the understanding that they were not exactly parlor reading. French novels, particularly those of Flaubert and Zola, which dealt with female desire and marital reality with a frankness that English fiction of the period rarely matched, were read by more English women than the official record would suggest, often in the original French that a genteel education had provided. The sensation novels that became enormously popular in the 1860s, Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, and Armadale, were officially disapproved of by critics precisely because of the frankness with which they depicted women acting on desire, ambition, and anger, and they were devoured by female readers in extraordinary numbers. Lady Audley's Secret, which features a wife who commits bigamy, arson, and attempted murder in pursuit of the life she wants, was one of the best-selling novels of the Victorian period. The moral establishment clutched its collective pearls. Women bought copies by the thousand. The poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, particularly sonnets from the Portuguese, expressed female desire with an explicitness of feeling that proper Victorian convention would have frowned on, and was read and loved by enormous numbers of women who recognized in it something of their own experience. Aurora Leigh, Barrett Browning's verse novel about a woman writer refusing to abandon her art for conventional marriage, was another text that spoke directly to the private frustrations of women living inside the constraints of the era. Medical texts were another category of forbidden reading that circulated more widely among women than was officially acknowledged. The marriage manuals and medical guides of the period, books with titles like Conjugal Duties and The Wife's Companion that dealt with the physical realities of marriage and reproduction, were technically respectable enough to exist in print while being practically unavailable to unmarried women and rarely discussed openly by married ones. They circulated nevertheless. The demand for accurate information about one's own body was not eliminated by the social convention that such information was improper. There was also the phenomenon of what the Victorian period called fast reading, the consumption of penny dreadfuls, sensational journalism, and cheap fiction of various kinds that the lower and working classes had access to, and that middle-class women read covertly with considerable relish. The criminal trials reported in the newspapers provided a particularly reliable source of information about the reality of lives very different from the respectable middle-class ideal, and Victorian newspaper coverage of murder trials, in particular, contained details about sex, money, violence, and human motivation that fiction was not permitted to approach. The hidden shelf, the book kept beneath the pillow or behind the more respectable volumes on the library shelf, the novel passed between friends with meaningful looks. These were standard features of Victorian female domestic life. Women read what they wanted to read. They just did it carefully. One of the most significant and consistently underestimated aspects of Victorian women's hidden life was the world that existed within female friendship, the passionate, intense, physically affectionate, emotionally sustaining bonds between women that Victorian culture simultaneously approved of in theory and refused to fully examine in practice. Because Victorian culture drew such a sharp distinction between the sexes and organized social life around that distinction, women and men lived in many respects in separate social worlds. Women spent the majority of their social time with other women, at morning calls, at needlework circles, at the drawing room gatherings, from which men had retired to the library or the smoking room, at the elaborate female visiting networks that connected middle class households across a neighborhood. In that female world, relationships between women could reach an intensity and intimacy that would have been impossible in mixed company. The Victorians had a term for particularly close female friendships. They called them romantic friendships, and they were considered entirely respectable, even admirable. Two women who were devoted to each other, who spent most of their time together, who wrote each other ardent letters when separated, who embraced and held hands and slept in the same bed during visits, were understood to be engaged in a form of pure female sentiment that had nothing improper about it. The question of where romantic friendship ended and what we would now recognize as romantic or sexual love began is one that historians have debated extensively, and the honest answer is that there was no clear line, and that in many cases the women involved may not have been drawing one either. The letters exchanged between some Victorian female friends have a frankness of feeling, a physical tenderness, a jealousy and longing when separated that is indistinguishable from love letters. Whether the physical dimension of these relationships went further than sleeping in the same bed and embracing affectionately in the parlor is something the surviving record rarely makes explicit, partly because there were no reliable words in the Victorian vocabulary for what would have had to be happening for that to be the case, and partly because women who kept careful diaries knew that some things were safer left unwritten. What is clear is that female friendship in the Victorian era provided a space of emotional and physical intimacy that marriage often did not. A woman's husband was, in the official ideology, her companion and protector and the head of her household, but he was also, in many cases, essentially a stranger she had known for a short time before marrying, with whom she shared a bed, but perhaps not much else. Her female friends, by contrast, were the people who had known her since girlhood, who shared her particular female experience of the world, who could be told things that could never be told to a man. The calling card system, which I mentioned earlier, had its own secondary communication layer. The corner of the card that was folded down indicated the nature of the call, different corners for different types of visit and combinations thereof. The message that a card conveyed could therefore say one thing in its formal content, the name of the caller, their address, and something different in its physical presentation to anyone who knew how to read it. The social system that was supposed to contain and control female social interactions had built into its own structure a mechanism for sending messages that the system's official managers couldn't fully intercept. The secret language aspect of Victorian female social communication points to something important about the broader situation. Women who are denied direct modes of expression will find indirect ones. The indirection isn't evidence of weakness or passivity, it's evidence of ingenuity operating under constraint. Victorian women were enormously fluent in the indirect mode. They had to be. Beyond the specific question of hysteria treatment that we discussed earlier, the Victorian relationship between female bodies and the medical establishment was a complicated and often deeply uncomfortable one that repays careful examination. The medicalization of the female body, the tendency to treat the normal physical experiences of women's lives as medical conditions requiring professional intervention, was a significant feature of Victorian medicine. Menstruation was treated as a period of illness, requiring rest and restriction of activity. Pregnancy and childbirth were increasingly brought into the medical domain and away from the traditional female world of midwives and female birth attendants. Menopause was described in medical literature as a dangerous transition during which women were particularly susceptible to a range of physical and psychological disorders. The practical effect of this medicalization was to give the male medical establishment significant authority over female bodies and female experience at the moments when those bodies and experiences were most specifically female. The physician who told a middle class woman that menstruation required her to rest, avoid cold baths, and abstain from vigorous intellectual activity was exercising an authority that was simultaneously professional and deeply personal, and that some women experienced as helpful, while others experienced as infuriating and infantilizing. The women who pushed back against medicalized femininity were often doing so in the context of the broader feminist movements of the period. The campaign for women's entry into the medical profession was partly about access to a respected career, but it was also explicitly about the need for female physicians who could attend to female patients without the particular dynamics that male physicians brought to those encounters. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who qualified as a physician in 1865, through a combination of legal ingenuity and institutional persistence, understood this dimension of her work very clearly and described it in those terms. The Boston marriage, the term for two women who live together in a domestic partnership, sharing a home and a life, was a recognized social arrangement in the later Victorian and Edwardian period, particularly in America, but to a degree in Britain as well. These arrangements were officially understood as practical and companionate. Two women of limited means sharing expenses, two women with careers who found it convenient to share a household. Whether they were also, in some cases, romantic partnerships in the fuller sense, was something that the era's polite convention carefully declined to investigate. The freedom that female intimacy provided from the official performance of Victorian femininity should not be underestimated. In the company of their closest female friends, Victorian women could be a great deal more themselves. They could express opinions they would never have voiced in mixed company. They could complain about their husbands, their children, their bodies, their boredom, their frustrated ambitions. They could laugh freely, eat without restraint, take off their stays, sit in unladylike positions, and conduct conversations that had nothing to do with being decorative or improving. The female sphere that Victorian culture intended to be a space of domestic confinement became in practice a space of considerable social freedom. precisely because men were largely absent from it, and therefore unable to monitor or police what happened within it. The official story of Victorian womanhood had no room for professional ambition. Women were supposed to find their fulfillment in the domestic sphere, in the careful management of a household, the raising of children, the cultivation of feminine accomplishments like music and sketching and embroidery. The idea of a woman pursuing a career in medicine, law, science, journalism, or any other professional field was for most of the Victorian period considered either comical or alarming, depending on who was doing the considering. And yet Victorian women wrote. They wrote novels and poetry and journalism and criticism and scientific papers and political pamphlets and religious tracts and travel writing. They painted and sculpted and composed music. They managed estates and ran businesses and organized campaigns and founded institutions. They did all of this in the teeth of active institutional resistance, and many of them did it while maintaining a public persona of perfect domestic propriety. The strategies they used to navigate the gap between what they were doing and what they were supposed to be doing were often ingenious. Many Victorian women writers published under male pseudonyms or under initials that obscured their gender. Mary Ann Evans became George Eliot. The Bronte sisters published as Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell before their identities became known. The pseudonym protected the work from the automatic critical condescension that attached to writing known to be by a woman, and it also protected the woman from the social consequences of being known as someone who had the presumption to write. Others worked in the early hours of the morning before the household woke, or in the late hours after it had gone to bed, or in whatever gaps the day's domestic obligations allowed. Jane Austen, writing slightly before the Victorian period proper, but in the same cultural tradition, was said to write on small pieces of paper that could quickly be covered when anyone entered the room. The squeak of the parlor door was her warning. The concealment of the work was as much a habit as the work itself. The women who pursued scientific knowledge faced particular challenges. The learned societies that organized and validated scientific inquiry in Victorian England excluded women from membership for most of the period. Women could attend some lectures as visitors, but not as participants. They could correspond with male scientists, but were often uncredited for their contributions. The astronomer Caroline Herschel, the mathematician and computing pioneer Ada Lovelace, the crystallographer Rosalind Franklin, the pattern of brilliant women working within and around the institutional exclusions of their era extends across the Victorian period and well beyond it. Florence Nightingale is remembered as the founder of modern nursing, but she was also a significant statistician who invented new forms of data visualization to make mortality data comprehensible to politicians, and who wrote a devastating unpublished feminist text called Cassandra that excoriated the enforced idleness of middle-class Victorian women with a fury that she knew she could never publish under her own name in her own lifetime. The public Nightingale was a ministering angel who had nobly devoted herself to caring. The private Nightingale was a woman of formidable intellectual ambition who found the constraints of her sex very nearly intolerable. Even within the domestic sphere, the management of a large Victorian household was a genuinely complex administrative undertaking that required real organizational and financial skill. The mistress of a middle class household supervised multiple servants, managed detailed household accounts, coordinated the catering for elaborate social events, maintained the social networks that supported the family's reputation, and organized the education and domestic training of the children, all while making the whole operation appear effortless, because effort was itself considered slightly vulgar. The skills required were considerable. The credit given was minimal. What ambition looked like for most Victorian women, in practice, was not the dramatic gesture of the published novel or the scientific discovery, but the quieter, more persistent work of expanding what was possible within the available space. The woman who managed to read more widely than was strictly approved. The woman who found ways to keep her own money rather than surrendering it entirely to a husband. The woman who cultivated friendships with other intellectually serious women and conducted, through those friendships, a kind of parallel intellectual life that had no official standing but was utterly real. The Victorian bedroom was officially a site of sanctioned but unspeakable intimacy, a place where the respectable middle class marriage produced its legitimate heirs, and where the details of how those heirs came to be were considered entirely private, which is to say, it was a space where a great deal was happening and practically nothing was said about it. The official Victorian narrative about female sexuality was by modern standards quite extraordinary. The prevailing view, articulated by medical authorities and social commentators with varying degrees of conviction, was that women of good breeding did not experience sexual desire in the way that men did. A woman's role in the marital act was to submit graciously to a husband's needs, not to have needs of her own. The idea that a respectable woman might actively want sex was considered either a medical anomaly or evidence of a somewhat doubtful character. This view was, of course, entirely false. The private evidence, the diaries, the letters, the confidences preserved in the records of trusted female friends makes clear that Victorian women experienced sexual desire in the full and ordinary human way. What the era had done was not to eliminate female desire, but create an extremely powerful cultural framework within which that desire had to be carefully managed and, when necessary, denied. The reality of sex within Victorian marriages was considerably more varied than the official story of female passivity and male initiative would suggest. Some marriages were characterized by genuine mutual desire and considerable physical satisfaction, recorded in terms that make clear both parties were active and interested participants. Lady Constance Lytton, the suffragette, wrote about the frank happiness of couples she knew whose private lives bore no resemblance to the public ideal of restrained Victorian matrimony. Queen Victoria herself, in her private correspondence, wrote about her husband Albert in ways that make her enthusiasm for the marital side of her marriage fairly unmistakable, despite having famously expressed what may have been a somewhat different view of the physical side of conjugal duty in other contexts. There was also the well documented reality of Victorian marriage guides that circulated among married couples and that dealt with the physical realities of marriage with considerably more frankness than public discourse would have suggested was available. Some of these guides were progressive by the standards of the time, explicitly acknowledging female desire and the importance of mutual satisfaction, William Acton, the physician often cited for his claim that respectable women didn't experience sexual feeling, was actually arguing against a view he felt was too permissive, which suggests that the too permissive view had sufficient circulation to require rebutting. The separation of bedrooms that became fashionable in larger Victorian households, each spouse having their own room with connecting doors that could be opened or closed at will, gave married Victorian women a degree of physical autonomy in the marriage that the era's official ideology rather underemphasized. A woman with her own bedroom could decline her husband's visits or encourage them or manage the timing of her own conceptions in ways that gave her more reproductive agency than the complete absence of reliable contraception might suggest. And there was the whole question of what Victorian women did when they were not with their husbands at all. The long tradition of what the era called self abuse and what the era was entirely convinced was causing epidemic nervous debility in the young of both sexes was, despite the enormous volume of alarm generated about it by medical writers and moralists, simply a fact of human life that the Victorian era was no more successful at eliminating than any other. The moral panic about it tells us less about its actual prevalence than about the deep anxiety the era had about the body conducting itself outside the framework of sanctioned purposes. The net effect of all of this is that the bedroom of the respectable Victorian household was considerably less tidy, ideologically speaking, than its public presentation suggested. Desire existed. It found expression in various forms that the official culture preferred not to look at too directly. The Victorian woman who maintained her perfect propriety in the drawing room had, in the privacy of her own bedroom, a much fuller human life than the drawing room would ever have indicated. Not all of the Victorian woman's private pleasures were secret in the strict sense. Some of them were entirely official, unsanctioned, even encouraged, and simply operated at a level of sensory richness that the era's public discourse about female propriety and restraint tended to understate. Food, so for instance. The official narrative of Victorian femininity emphasized a certain delicacy of appetite. The idea that a truly refined woman ate very little, found heavy eating coarse, and was sustained by the lightness of her constitution rather than the quantity of her calories. This narrative was, in practice, almost entirely fictional. Victorian middle class women ate prodigiously. The meals served in respectable Victorian households were enormous by modern standards: multiple courses at dinner, extensive tea spreads in the afternoon, substantial breakfasts. The women who presided over these meals and planned and organized their production were not doing so while picking delicately at a few morsels themselves. The diaries of Victorian women record with genuine enthusiasm the pleasures of food, the particular excellence of a cook's pastry, the triumph of a successful dinner party, the private satisfaction of a well managed household provision. Food was one of the few areas of sensory life in which a Victorian woman could take open pleasure without attracting significant moral commentary. Alcohol was more complicated. The temperance movement was powerful in Victorian England, and middle class women were understood to drink in moderation, if at all. But the domestic consumption of various fortified wines, cordials, and medicinal tonics that were essentially alcoholic gave Victorian women access to the pleasurable effects of alcohol within a framework that preserved respectability. Patent medicines containing significant quantities of alcohol, and in many cases, laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, were marketed specifically to women for the treatment of nervous complaints, menstrual pain, and a range of other conditions. These medicines were sold in pharmacies without prescription, consumed openly at home, and provided what their users described as considerable relief, without requiring the user to acknowledge that she had taken anything stronger than medicine. The use of laudanum, opium tincture, was so widespread among Victorian women of all classes as to constitute a public health issue of considerable scale. It was prescribed by physicians, purchased over the counter, given to babies to quiet them, taken for everything from headaches to period pain to general anxiety. The sensation it produced, a warm, floating calm that dissolved the pressures of the day, was described in contemporary accounts in terms that make its appeal very easy to understand. Quite a lot of Victorian women were, in modern terminology, dependent on opiates. The era called it taking one's medicine. The bath was another sphere of private physical pleasure that operated in relative freedom from scrutiny. The Victorian bathroom, as it gradually evolved across the period from a portable hip bath in the bedroom to a dedicated room with running water, was one of the few genuinely private spaces in a middle-class woman's life. No servants need be present during bathing. No husband had reason to be. The bathroom was a space of solitude and physical ease in a life that provided very little of either. The expansion of the hot bath across the Victorian period, as plumbing improved and hot water became more accessible, was experienced by many Victorian women as a straightforward and considerable pleasure. Diaries and letters note the satisfaction of a hot bath with the same uncomplicated enthusiasm as a good meal or a beautiful sunset. The body at ease, warm and clean and private, was a pleasure that required no justification and attracted no moral commentary, which made it, in the landscape of Victorian female life, something of a rarity. The garden was another officially approved space of physical engagement that could reach a degree of sensory richness that went considerably beyond the decorous enjoyment of flowers. Victorian women's gardening was sometimes pursued with the same intensity and expertise that men brought to their public professional work, and in the garden, which was considered a suitably feminine space of cultivation and nurturing, that intensity attracted less opposition than it would have in almost any other domain. The female patient who found herself in a Victorian physician's consulting room was navigating a situation with multiple layers. She was ill or believed herself to be ill. She was attempting to describe physical experiences to a man who had very limited understanding of female physiology and who was operating within a theoretical framework that attributed a great deal of female ill health to uterine disturbance. She was doing this in the context of social conventions that made it extremely difficult to speak plainly about the body, and she was making decisions about what to report, what to conceal, whether the prescribed treatment was actually helpful or merely embarrassing, within a private space that was officially about health, but was also inevitably about power. Some Victorian women were extremely savvy about this dynamic and managed it accordingly. They reported symptoms strategically emphasizing what was likely to produce a useful prescription and minimizing what was likely to produce an unhelpful lecture. They sought out physicians whose approach they found helpful and avoided those whose approach they did not. They compared notes with female friends about which medical men were worth consulting and which were not. The informal female network of medical intelligence, who to see and who to avoid, and what to tell them and what not to, was a significant body of practical knowledge that circulated in the female social world entirely outside official medical discourse. The women who took their prescriptions for laudanum home and found them helpful, who returned for their regular appointments with their physicians and found those appointments relieving, who read the sections of marriage manuals that described the physical dimension of conjugal relations and found them informative. These women were getting what they needed from a system that officially denied they needed it. The Victorian female relationship with medicine was in this sense entirely consistent with the Victorian female relationship with everything else, officially constrained, practically ingenious, and considerably less passive than the surface presentation suggested. The middle class Victorian household ran on domestic service. A family of even modest respectability typically employed at least one servant, a general maid of all work who cooked, cleaned, answered the door, and did whatever else was required. A more comfortable household might have a cook, a parlor maid, a lady's maid, a nursemaid, a gardener, and various other specialized staff. The largest Victorian households employed dozens of servants in a complex hierarchy that had its own elaborate internal culture and social structure. The presence of servants in the Victorian domestic space created a peculiar social dynamic around privacy that is one of the more interesting aspects of the era. Middle class Victorians moved through their homes in the knowledge that they were, at any given moment, potentially being observed by their servants. The maid might enter any room, the cook was always in the kitchen, the housemaid cleaned the bedroom every morning, including making the bed and examining whatever had been left on the nightstand or left carelessly in a drawer. This awareness of servant observation created a pressure toward discretion and concealment in domestic life that complemented the pressure of public respectability. The diary that a Victorian woman kept was kept private not only from her husband and her social circle, but from her servants, who had the most physical access to her private space. The hiding of reading materials, the locking of drawers, the burning of letters, these practices were shaped partly by the knowledge that the bedroom was cleaned by someone who might read anything left in the open. One of the persistent myths about Victorian women is that they were kept in a state of near perfect ignorance about the realities of the world outside their domestic sphere, that they were shielded from knowledge of sex, crime, poverty, politics, and human behavior more generally by a combination of protective convention and limited access to information. This myth is not entirely without foundation. There were real institutional barriers to female access to information. University education was closed to women for most of the period. Professional associations excluded them. The formal channels through which knowledge was organized and credentialed did not acknowledge female participation, and the etiquette of polite conversation actively enforced certain silences in mixed company. One did not discuss anything too frank, too controversial, or too interesting in the drawing room. But Victorian women were far better informed about the realities of their world than the official narrative of their shielded innocence would suggest. The newspapers were the first reason why. Victorian newspapers reported on criminal trials, parliamentary debates, social scandals, financial disasters, and foreign affairs with a comprehensiveness and detail that is quite striking by modern standards. Middle class households took newspapers. Women read them. The fiction that a woman should remain ignorant of parliamentary doings or criminal activity could not fully survive in a household where the morning paper was available to anyone who picked it up. The divorce courts, which became a public institution with the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, provided Victorian newspaper readers with a regular supply of detailed and extremely frank testimony about the private lives of English marriages. Adultery, cruelty, sexual incapacity, the precise details of who had been in which hotel room, with whom on which dates. All of this was reported in the press with a thoroughness that required readers to be considerably less innocent than they were supposed to be. The Victorian woman who read the newspaper was, whether or not she acknowledged it, very well informed about what went on in bedrooms and back parlors across the social spectrum. Gossip was the other great information channel, and it operated in the female social networks of Victorian England with extraordinary efficiency. The morning call, the ritual of afternoon visiting that structured middle class female social life, was officially a ceremony of social connection and mutual support. In practice, it was also an extremely effective intelligence gathering system. The carefully structured small talk of Victorian social calling concealed, from men, a vigorous exchange of actual information about marriages, affairs, financial difficulties, family scandals, health problems, and the sexual behavior of various persons known to all parties. Women knew things. They knew which marriages were unhappy and why. They knew which men were drinking or gambling or keeping mistresses. They knew which women had managed to limit their family size despite the absence of reliable contraception, and they sometimes knew how. They knew which husbands were brutal and which were merely tedious. They knew the financial realities of households that presented a face of comfortable prosperity. This knowledge was not available through official channels. It lived in the female information network, passed along in morning calls and letters and private conversations between trusted friends, and it constituted a substantial body of practical understanding about how the world actually worked. The strategic management of this knowledge, knowing when to share it, with whom, in what form, was itself a skill that Victorian women developed to a considerable degree of sophistication. Information was social currency in Victorian female society, and the women who managed it well had access to influence and understanding that their official exclusion from formal power structures would not have predicted. Victorian social life was organized by an elaborate set of rituals and conventions that modern people tend to find simultaneously ridiculous and exhausting. The calling card, the formal call, the rules about who called on whom first, and how soon after a social introduction, and what the correct etiquette was for returning a call, and what a card left with a turned down corner meant versus a card left without. The whole apparatus was vast and detailed, and consumed a significant portion of the social energy of the middle class Victorian woman. But within this elaborate system of convention, there was also a great deal of room for the exercise of social power that the official description of the system tended to obscure. The decision of whether or not to call, to leave a card or fail to leave one, to return a visit or decline to do so, was a genuine act of social judgment that could include, exclude, sanction, or ostracize with remarkable effectiveness. Victorian women exercised this judgment constantly, and did so with considerable deliberateness. The letter was the other great instrument of Victorian female social and emotional life, and like the diary, it occupied a dual position as both officially approved activity and genuinely private space. Women were expected to write letters. Correspondence was a feminine accomplishment and a social duty. But the letter, once written and sealed and dispatched, was also a space of considerable freedom. You could say in a letter what you could not say in person. You could express feelings that the drawing room did not permit. You could be, on the page, considerably more yourself than you were required to be in public. The letters that Victorian women wrote to each other reveal the same gap between public performance and private reality that the diaries show, but with an additional dimension because they were written to be read by another specific person. The letters between close Victorian female friends have an emotional directness and physical warmth that the conventions of their era otherwise suppressed entirely. I long to hold you in my arms, writes one Victorian woman to her dearest friend during a period of separation, and to feel your head upon my shoulder as it used to be. This is not the language of the drawing room. It is the language of the private female world, where different rules applied. Servants, for their part, knew a great deal more about the private lives of their employers than the class conventions of the era acknowledged. The housemaid who made the beds and emptied the chamber pots and collected the laundry had a comprehensive knowledge of the physical realities of the household. The cook who prepared the meals understood which family members ate with appetite and which picked at their food in ways that suggested anxiety or illness. The lady's maid who helped her mistress dress and undress daily had an intimate knowledge of the mistress's body that no one else in the household shared. The relationship between a Victorian lady and her lady's maid was one of the more intimate relationships in middle class life, precisely because of this daily physical proximity. The lady's maid helped with dressing and undressing, styled the hair, assisted with bathing, mended the clothes, managed the wardrobe, and served as a kind of personal attendant who was present at the most physically intimate moments of daily domestic life. These relationships could be cold and purely functional, but they could also develop into something considerably warmer, a real domestic intimacy that crossed the class divide in ways that the formal social structure of the household otherwise prevented. The servant's perspective on Victorian female privacy also cut the other way. The knowledge that servants possessed about their employers was itself a kind of power, carefully not exercised in most cases, but present. The maid who knew which locked drawer her mistress kept her diary in, who had seen the covers of the novels on the hidden shelf, who had carried letters to the post that were not addressed to anyone the household would have expected. This knowledge was retained and kept in confidence as part of the unwritten compact of domestic service. Discretion was a professional virtue, and its silent exercise, year after year, was one of the things that made the private female life of the Victorian household possible. The development of the railway across Victorian England transformed the geography of leisure in ways that had particular significance for middle class women. Before the railways, travel was slow, expensive, and logistically complicated in ways that made it a relatively rare experience for most people. The railways made it fast, relatively affordable, and increasingly accessible, and with that accessibility came a new kind of freedom of movement that Victorian women were quick to take advantage of. The seaside holiday became a Victorian institution, particularly with the middle classes who could afford to take a week or two at one of the expanding coastal resorts that the railways had made accessible. And the seaside, as a physical and social environment, offered Victorian women something that their ordinary domestic lives did not provide: a space of considerably relaxed social convention. The bathing machine, the wheeled hut that was drawn into the sea by a horse so that a bather could descend into the water from relative privacy, was the official Victorian technology for managing the impropriety of women appearing in public in wet clothing, and it was used enthusiastically by many Victorian women who found the experience of immersion in cold salt water genuinely pleasurable. The bathing dress that women wore for sea bathing was not exactly liberating by modern standards. Heavy woolen garments designed to conceal rather than facilitate movement through water. But the act of being in the sea, with the specific physical freedom that buoyancy provides, was an experience that many Victorian diarists recorded with obvious delight. The holiday more generally represented a relaxation of the domestic routine that gave Victorian women a kind of breathing space they rarely had at home. The household management obligations that consumed a significant portion of daily energy at home were reduced or transferred during a holiday at a boarding house or hotel. The social calling round was suspended. The domestic production requirements, the menus to plan, the servants to supervise, the accounts to keep, were absent or simplified. What remained was leisure time, in a degree that most Victorian women's ordinary lives did not provide. Letters also served practical purposes that the official account of Victorian female life tended to understate. The network of female correspondence that connected middle class Victorian households was a genuine information infrastructure, a way of coordinating knowledge, support, and collective action across geographic distances. When a woman needed to know about a reputable physician, a reliable servant, a trustworthy school, or the truth about a potential husband's financial and personal situation, she wrote to her network. The answers came back through the same channel. The female correspondence network was, in effect, a private intelligence service operating entirely outside male oversight. The destruction of letters, like the destruction of diaries, was a significant social practice in Victorian England, particularly around death. Women who knew they were dying or who were managing the papers of a deceased friend systematically destroyed correspondence that they felt the world had no business reading. The bonfire of private letters that accompanied many Victorian deaths was an act of discretion, loyalty, and protective self-presentation, an erasure of the private woman by the private woman herself or by those she trusted. Victorian women were expected to be religious. That was part of the official deal. Piety was feminine, church attendance was feminine, the spiritual life was understood to be particularly suited to women, whose finer sensibilities and freedom from the corrupting influences of commerce and public life made them naturally more receptive to divine truth. This expectation was in many ways a significant constraint. It limited the range of opinions a respectable woman could express. It required the performance of devout observance, regardless of actual belief, and it subjected women to the moral supervision of an institution that was at the institutional level run entirely by men. But Victorian women also found, within the framework of religion, considerably more freedom and power than the official account of feminine piety would suggest. The evangelical movements that swept through Victorian England in various waves created spaces of female religious activity, leadership, and public speech that had no equivalent elsewhere in respectable middle class life. Quaker women had been preaching publicly for centuries, and Victorian Quaker women continued to do so within their communities with full institutional approval. Salvation Army women preached in the streets from the organization's founding in the 1860s. Various nonconformist denominations gave women roles in leadership and public speech that the Church of England denied them. The prayer meeting, the missionary society, the Sunday school, the charitable organization, these were spaces where Victorian women organized, led, spoke, and exercised real institutional power within the framework of religious service. The charitable and social reform organizations that Victorian women founded and ran through the framework of religious obligation were often genuinely significant institutions. Josephine Butler's campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which subjected women suspected of prostitution to compulsory medical examination, was one of the most remarkable political campaigns of the Victorian era, conducted largely by women through networks of female religious and moral reform organizations on a subject that respectable female society was not supposed to be able to discuss at all. Butler discussed it with unflinching directness, in public, in print, and in testimony before parliamentary committees. She won eventually. The private religious life of Victorian women also provided a space that was genuinely their own, a dimension of inner life that no one else had access to, and that didn't require the same performance that the rest of existence demanded. The diary entries of Victorian women often contain their most honest writing when they are addressing God rather than themselves or an imagined reader. The frank account of anger, frustration, doubt, and desire that social convention required to be suppressed elsewhere, finding expression in the form of prayer. There was also the spiritualist movement, which became enormously popular in the later Victorian period, and which offered women a role as mediums that placed them at the center of something considered genuinely powerful. The Victorian medium, who could communicate with the dead and channel messages from beyond, was exercising a kind of authority that no other social role available to women provided. Whether or not the phenomena were genuine, and the evidence suggests that a significant proportion of Victorian spiritualism involved deliberate or self-deceived fraud, the social space it created for female authority and public speech was real and was used. Before 1870, when the first Married Women's Property Act was passed, a married woman in England had essentially no legal existence as separate from her husband. Her property, her income, her wages, if she had any, all of it became his on marriage. She could not make contracts, sue or be sued, or own anything in her own name. She was, in the language of the law, a femme couverte, a covered woman, her legal identity absorbed into that of her husband. The practical reality of this legal situation was, as you might expect, rather more complex and varied than the law itself would suggest. The legal incapacity of married women was partly navigated through the equity courts, which had long recognized trusts that could hold property on behalf of married women separately from the husband's estate. Middle class families, who were alive to the risk of a daughter's inheritance disappearing into the control of an irresponsible or unlucky husband, used these trusts to preserve female assets across generations. But there was also the informal economy of female financial management that operated at the household level, entirely outside the legal framework. The household money that a husband gave to his wife for domestic management was, in practice, money over which she had considerable discretion. Victorian household management manuals acknowledged openly that a clever wife could arrange the household expenses in such a way as to produce a surplus, and that surplus was, informally, hers. It might be saved in a secret tin, deposited with a sympathetic tradesperson who kept informal accounts for female customers, lent to female friends in need, or spent on things a husband would not have chosen to fund. What Victorian women did with holiday leisure time is instructive. They walked far more than convention at home would have encouraged, covering distances and terrain that would have been considered remarkably vigorous for people whose physical constitution was officially delicate. They swam, they sketched and painted and wrote letters and read novels without the constraints that home imposed on those activities. They formed holiday friendships with other women that had the particular intensity of relationships formed in a temporary space where ordinary social hierarchies were slightly suspended. The more adventurous Victorian women went further than the English seaside. Female travel writing became a significant genre in the Victorian period, as women who had traveled in Europe, Asia, Africa, and America wrote accounts of their journeys that were read with appetite by women who were doing their traveling vicariously. Isabella Bird, who explored the Rocky Mountains on horseback and wrote about it. Mary Kingsley, who traveled through West Africa alone and with remarkable competence. Gertrude Bell, who became one of the foremost authorities on the Middle East. These women were doing something that the official account of Victorian femininity had absolutely no category for, and doing it in plain sight. The woman abroad was, in several important respects, freer than the woman at home. The particular social surveillance of the known community, the neighbors who noted your goings and comings, the acquaintances who observed your behavior at church and at social calls, the web of local knowledge and local judgment that shaped every public appearance, was absent. A Victorian woman traveling in Egypt or Switzerland or America was not subject to the same scrutiny and therefore had considerably more latitude. The diaries and letters of Victorian women travelers often have a freedom and openness that their domestic correspondence lacks because they were written by women who were temporarily but really operating outside the usual constraints. The formal transmission of knowledge in Victorian England ran almost entirely through channels that were controlled by men and organized around male professional and institutional authority. Universities, learned societies, professional associations, the church, the law, all of these were male institutions in which women participated, when they participated at all, at the margins and on sufferance. But there was another knowledge transmission system operating in parallel to the official one, conducted entirely within the female world and often invisible to the male institutions that considered themselves the keepers of knowledge. This was the informal educational network through which Victorian women taught each other the things they needed to know: practical, personal, and sometimes explicitly dangerous knowledge that the official channels either withheld or presented in forms that were inaccessible to most women. The knowledge of how to manage a large household was transmitted this way, through the mentorship of experienced women to younger ones, through the detailed correspondence that passed between sisters and mothers and daughters about the management of servants, the planning of menus, the preservation of food, the nursing of sick children, the management of a household budget. This knowledge was genuinely complex and genuinely important, and its transmission was entirely outside any institutional framework. Knowledge about the body was transmitted the same way, because the official channels were either unavailable or actively misleading. What happened during childbirth, and what to expect, what to do when a baby had colic or a child had a fever, how to manage menstrual pain, what the physical realities of marriage would involve. All of this was passed from woman to woman, in letters and in conversation, in the female networks that connected households across generations and geographies. The most sensitive category of female transmitted knowledge was information about fertility and its management. Victorian women had no access to reliable modern contraception, but this did not mean they had no knowledge of reproductive management. Folk methods, extended breastfeeding, which genuinely does suppress ovulation, timing of intercourse, various herbal preparations of varying effectiveness, barrier methods known and discussed in medical literature that women accessed through various channels, circulated in female networks with the particular intensity that attaches to information on which significant aspects of your life depend. The women who managed to have smaller families than the average, and there were such women identifiable in the demographic record, were doing so through some combination of these methods, often accessed through the female knowledge network rather than through official medical channels. A woman whose letters to her sister contain a certain particular advice about timing and method was transmitting information that could make a real difference in the shape of another woman's life. The female educational institutions that developed through the Victorian period, the schools and colleges founded specifically for women, were themselves a form of collective female knowledge transmission. The women who founded Girton and Newnham at Cambridge, who lobbied for women's education, who taught in the emerging girls' schools, were not simply providing women with access to existing knowledge. They were creating the conditions under which women could develop and transmit knowledge on their own terms, within their own institutions, without requiring male gatekeeping or male approval. By the end of the Victorian period, this educational infrastructure had grown enough to make a real difference in the options available to middle class women. A woman born in 1880 who was determined to pursue her intellectual ambitions had resources available to her that her grandmother could not have imagined. Not because the world had suddenly become generous toward female ambition, but because generations of women had built, piece by careful piece, the institutional structures that made it possible. The Victorian pin money, the small personal allowance that a husband might provide to his wife for her personal expenses, was another space of female financial autonomy within a system that officially denied women financial agency. How pin money was spent was within limits the wife's own business, and the category of personal expenses could be interpreted with considerable latitude by a woman who needed it to be. The legal changes that came with the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 shifted this situation fundamentally, giving married women the right to own property and retain their own earnings. The women who had been navigating the old system with ingenuity and patience now found themselves with formal legal standing to match their practical resourcefulness. The combination was, for those who were in a position to take advantage of it, genuinely liberating. Working class women had always worked, of course, and the question of financial survival was for them not a matter of quiet subversion, but of pressing daily necessity. The factory worker, the domestic servant, the seamstress, the laundress, the street vendor, these women were financially active in ways that the respectable, middle class ideal of female economic passivity never pretended to describe. The gap between the lives of middle class women, for whom the performance of economic dependence was a social obligation, and working class women, for whom independent earning was simply a fact of survival, was one of the great chasms of Victorian society. By the 1880s and 1890s, the angel in the house was starting to look a little frayed around the edges. The cultural ideal of passive, domestic, self effacing femininity that had dominated the middle decades of the Victorian period was coming under increasing pressure from several directions simultaneously, and the women who were pushing back against it were doing so with more visibility and less apology than their predecessors. The new woman, a term that appeared in the 1880s and became a cultural flashpoint through the 1890s, was the figure who concentrated the anxieties of the era about changing female behavior. She was characterized, in the popular imagination and in the satirical press, by a set of attributes that the Victorian establishment found alarming. She was educated, she read serious books, she had opinions about politics, she might have a career, she rode a bicycle. The bicycle deserves particular attention because it was genuinely significant as a vehicle of female freedom, in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The safety bicycle, which became widely available in the late 1880s and 1890s, gave women a form of independent transportation that had no precedent. A woman on a bicycle could go where she wanted, when she wanted, without a companion or a chaperone or a hired conveyance. She was mobile, she was alone, she was, in a very concrete, physical sense, free. The moral panic about the bicycle and women was essentially a moral panic about that freedom. Critics argued that cycling was physically dangerous to women's reproductive organs, that the posture required was immodest, that the independence it afforded would lead to unsupervised encounters with inappropriate persons. They were not wrong about the independence, which was precisely the point. The women who took up cycling in the 1890s understood perfectly well what they were doing, and they did it with considerable enthusiasm. The reform of women's dress that the rational dress movement pursued through the same period, the campaign against tight lacing, against excessive weight of skirts, for garments that allowed women to move their bodies freely, was another dimension of the same shift. The argument that women's clothing was physically harmful and that reform was a matter of health rather than immodesty gave reformers a respectable framework within which to pursue what was actually a more fundamental challenge to the female body's social management. The suffrage movement, which became increasingly organized and increasingly visible through the last decades of the Victorian period, was the most explicit manifestation of the change that was coming. The women who marched and petitioned and wrote and organized in pursuit of the vote were drawing on decades of female organizational experience, female intellectual seriousness, and female political understanding that had been developing quietly within the spaces the official culture had provided, and around the edges of the spaces it had not. They were not, in other words, suddenly appearing from nowhere. They were the product of a century of Victorian women doing in private the intellectual and emotional and organizational work that the public world had not permitted them to do openly. The secret habits of Victorian women, the hidden reading, the private ambition, the female networks, the diaries, the intimate friendships, the quiet subversions of money and space and time were the preparation for what came next. Queen Victoria herself died in January 1901, and with her death, the era that bore her name officially ended. The world that followed was different in ways that the women of the mid Victorian period could barely have imagined, and in ways that the women of the late Victorian period had spent decades working toward. The distance between a respectable Victorian woman in 1850 performing her perfect propriety in the drawing room and a woman in 1920 voting for the first time is one of the great distances of modern history. It was covered inch by careful inch by generations of women who found ways to live within the constraints available to them as more fully themselves than the constraints officially allowed. We have spent the evening in the drawing rooms and the bedrooms and the gardens and the doctors' consulting rooms of Victorian England, and before we close, it seems fitting to end where we are right now, in the dark, in the quiet, in the particular privacy of the hours after the candles were snuffed and the household had retired. Victorian nights were genuinely dark in a way that is very difficult to fully imagine from within the relentless, artificial illumination of the modern world. Before gaslighting became widespread in the middle of the century, and before electric light began its gradual spread toward the end, nighttime in a Victorian household was lit only by candles and oil lamps and whatever the fireplace provided. That light was warm and local and left large swathes of every room in real darkness. The transition from the lit evening to the dark night was a transition into a different sensory world. The Victorian bedtime ritual was more elaborate than most modern equivalents. For a middle class woman, The removal of her clothing involved the reverse of the morning's dressing process, the unpinning of the hair, which was then brushed out with the assistance of the lady's maid or done oneself in the long meditative process that 100 strokes of the brush required. The removal of the corset with its particular relief of released pressure, the washing of the face and hands at the basin, the putting on of the nightgown, which for respectable Victorian women was a substantial garment, high necked, long sleeved, reaching to the feet, that managed the boundary between decency and sleep with the same thoroughness that waking dress managed it. And then the particular solitude of the Victorian woman's night. If her husband shared the bedroom, there was the negotiation of proximity and distance that every shared sleeping space involves. If she had her own room, as the wealthier Victorian women increasingly did, there was the unusual and possibly welcome privacy of sleeping alone. The nighttime was one of the few spaces in a Victorian woman's life that was genuinely and reliably hers. Victorian thought about dreams was caught between the older tradition of dream interpretation, the idea that dreams carried divine or prophetic content, and the emerging scientific understanding of dreaming as a physiological process. The women who kept dream diaries, who noted particularly vivid or troubling dreams in their regular diaries, were often reaching for a framework that neither the theological tradition nor the nascent science of the era quite provided. Dreams allowed the Victorian woman's interior life to express itself without the oversight of waking consciousness, and what surfaced there was sometimes quite different from what the waking performance required. The poetry that Victorian women wrote about dreams, Barrett Browning's, Christina Rossetti's, the countless lesser known poems in the women's magazines of the era, has a particular quality of compressed intensity that suggests the dream was a space of genuine psychological importance. The dream was where what couldn't be said in the drawing room found a form, where the desire that had no respectable name could appear, temporarily, under cover of sleep and emerge in the morning as a poem rather than as an action or a confession. The hours of the Victorian night were also, for women with nursing responsibilities, frequently interrupted. A baby waking, a sick child, a husband with an illness that required attendance. The night was not always the uninterrupted rest that its official status as sleeping time might suggest. Victorian women's accounts of long nights sitting with sick family members have a particular quality. The quietness of the house around them, the way the firelight moved on the walls, the strange slowing of time that accompanies the vigil at a sickbed. These hours were private in a different way than sleep. Private because the rest of the world was asleep, and the watcher was alone with her thoughts, in a way that waking life rarely permitted. Whatever else we might say about the Victorian woman's life, and we have said quite a lot this evening, her nights were her own in a way that her days rarely were. The official supervision relaxed, the performance requirements dimmed. The household slept around her, and the dark was her particular companion, and whatever she thought or felt or dreamed in those hours, she did so without the watching eyes that the daylight hours required her to perform for. Which means that right now, in this particular moment, as you lie in the dark with your eyes growing heavy and the day releasing its grip on your attention, you and the Victorian woman have something in common after all. The night has always been the same. The dark is always the same, the slow drift toward sleep, with its loosening of the day's demands and its quiet permission to simply be a body that is tired, that is not changed in 150 years. She had her secrets. She kept them with great skill. And then the candle went out, and the night was hers, and whatever she carried into sleep went with her into a privacy that no one has ever been able to follow. The woman who managed her household with meticulous precision, and her correspondence with careful warmth, and her diary with guarded honesty, she was not simply waiting for the modern world to arrive and release her. She was building it. Every act of quiet intelligence, every private ambition maintained against institutional resistance, every friendship that reached beyond the limits of what the era called appropriate, every letter written and burned, every night spent reading by a guttering candle the novel that couldn't be discussed at the morning call, all of it was a brick in the wall of what came next. The women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge that began accepting students in the 1870s and 1880s were built by women who had educated themselves in exactly this private, unofficial, determined way. The suffragette who chained herself to railings in 1912 had been preceded by the great grandmother who had kept her opinions in a locked diary in 1852. The novelist who published her third book under her own name in 1920 stood on the shoulders of the woman who had published her first under a male pseudonym in 1880, and that woman stood on the shoulders of the woman before her who had written in secret and burned everything. The lineage is real, even if it is not always visible. The private habits of the Victorian woman were not merely personal coping strategies. They were a form of cultural inheritance, passed quietly from one generation to the next through female networks of knowledge and solidarity and subversive ingenuity. We are the beneficiaries of those habits, whether or not we know their names. There is something worth pausing on in the sheer scope of what Victorian women managed to accomplish within the constraints that were placed on them. The novels that reshaped the literary tradition, the scientific work that was uncredited but foundational, the political campaigns that were conducted through channels so unofficial they barely appear in the standard histories, the educational institutions built through persistence and ingenuity against active institutional resistance, the households managed with such thorough competence that the management itself became invisible, which is, of course, how thoroughness works when it is done well enough. The Victorian woman who succeeded on the era's own terms, who was a perfectly proper wife and mother and social presence, was performing a feat of continuous, sophisticated self management that deserves its own recognition quite apart from what she was also doing in private. And the Victorian woman who refused those terms, or bent them, or worked around them, who found the gaps in the fence and moved through them quietly, and went on to write the book, or start the school, or maintain the friendship, or simply live, in whatever hidden interior space the era made available, as something closer to herself. She deserves that recognition too. They are the same women, more often than not. The perfect propriety and the hidden diary, the devoted wife and the secret correspondent, the respectable patient and the woman who went home relieved of her nervous complaints and didn't ask too many questions about the mechanism, the modest churchgoer and the woman who had read every French novel in the house and had opinions about all of them. The same woman, moving between worlds, fluent in both. That is, in the end, what is most interesting about the secret habits of Victorian women. Not the specific secrets themselves, interesting and surprising as they are, but the extraordinary flexibility and intelligence they imply. The ability to exist in multiple registers at once, to be simultaneously and with equal conviction the person the world required and the person you actually were, to live your whole life, in other words, at a level of psychological complexity that the official story of your era had no language for and no interest in acknowledging. Victorian women were, in this sense, very good at being human, much better, perhaps, than the simplified version of their lives that history has sometimes handed us, and the long, slow recovery of their full complexity through the diaries that survived the bonfires, the letters that were kept rather than burned, the scholarship that has spent decades reading carefully between the lines, is one of the more quietly satisfying intellectual projects of the past century. It is also, in a small way, an act of justice. Not the grand gesture of a monument or a statute, but something more intimate and more durable, the restoration of full personhood to women who were required by the conventions of their time to live with only a fraction of it visible. And so we leave the Victorian woman where we found her, in her drawing room perhaps, in her respectable dress, her expression composed, her hair arranged, her whole exterior a careful performance of everything she was supposed to be. But we leave her knowing what we now know, that beneath the corset, literally and figuratively, quite a lot was going on, that the diary in the locked drawer contained things the morning call never would, that the friendship with the woman 2 streets over was something that no respectable word fully captured, that the visit to the physician had its own particular resolution, that the novel under the pillow was not as innocuous as it looked, that the household money had a second set of accounts that only she knew about. The Victorian woman was above all enormously resourceful. She had to be. The constraints she operated within were real and significant. They shaped lives, limited possibilities, and caused genuine suffering, particularly for women without the education or the social position or the particular ingenious temperament to navigate them successfully. We should not romanticize what was in many respects a profoundly unjust arrangement. But within those constraints, she found the gaps, she found the private spaces and the private hours and the private languages. She found the friendships and the diaries and the hidden shelves and the medical consultations and the morning wrappers and the hot baths and the letters written in the full knowledge that they would be burned. She found ways to be more fully herself than the official story of her era allowed, and she passed the results of that finding on to the women who came after her, who could be a little less secret, a little less hidden, a little more openly themselves. We are, in some quiet way, the inheritors of those secrets. The freedom to read what we like and say what we think and live as we choose did not simply arrive one day from nowhere. It was negotiated, inch by careful inch, in drawing rooms and bedrooms and garden paths and locked diaries and the warm clasp of one woman's hand in another's. It was earned in the private hours by women whose names we mostly don't know, doing things they couldn't quite talk about, toward a future they could only partly imagine. The least we can do, as we drift toward sleep, in the comfortable freedom of our own particular evening is to notice that and to be, in whatever quiet way feels right, grateful. Thank you for spending this evening with Drowsy History. I hope somewhere in the slow parade of corsets and diaries and calling cards and secret novels and thoroughly clinical medical treatments, your eyes have grown heavy and the day has loosened its hold. If you haven't already, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if there's a corner of history you'd like to fall asleep inside next time, tell me that too. I read everyone. Until the next quiet evening together, rest well. The angel in the house would approve of you going to sleep. She would also have absolutely no idea what you were dreaming about, and that all things considered feels just about right. Good night.